Chapter 7, Understanding the Inner Millennium Shift. Have you ever dreamed of being in an earthquake? Or maybe you've had a nightmare of exploding volcanoes or violent tidal waves. When these kinds of images appear in your dreams, they might be prophetic statements of impending natural disasters. But just as likely, they mean that you're going through your own inner upheavals. In fact, during times of personal stress, these kinds of images can be expected from the unconscious mind. For most people, the inner millennium shift has already begun. Earthquakes and other physical changes may or may not be following Case's prophetic timetable. But there's no disputing one fact. The inner millennium shift is moving ahead. The personal testing is already upon us. Take a look at your own life. Some of your inner millennium shift challenges may be immediately obvious. Health crises, career failures, stressful relationships, but inner changes are not as always traumatic or catastrophic. In more subtle ways, they can seep into our lives and in small, unobtrusive ways succeed in stretching us to our limits. Sometimes these inner changes are happening, but we're only marginally conscious of their importance. We occasionally go through a very significant personal test without being fully aware of what it's all about. But even when the inner millennium shift comes subtly in its expression, it almost always has a potent impact. Of course, many of these kinds of problems have been going on throughout human history. What makes the times in which we live in any different or special? Case's prophecy was that the late 20th century and early 21st would be remarkable for the pace of demanding change and for its pervasive quality. Coupled with these two factors would be simultaneous transformation of cultural values and crucial support systems. Just consider what happens when all these factors collide. For example, it's one thing to go through a career failure, but at the same time still know what you believe in and where your values lie. People have been going through that sort of personal crisis for centuries, but it's quite another sort of challenge to lose your job and also live in a society that seems to have lost its rudder and forgotten what it believes in. In a similar way, people throughout history have had painful, debilitating health problems, especially in old age. But usually there were community support systems to help. In our modern world, illness often brings with it a sense of alienation. For example, as the elderly become sick, they're often removed from familiar society and placed in isolated living conditions. Other characteristics of the inner millennium shift are worth considering. As we see more and more of the features of these challenges, we're more likely to recognize these inner tests for what they are. Being able to name them and recognize their meaning is powerful medicine. Let's look carefully at a few of them. One aspect of the inner millennium shift with which many people are struggling is a sense of frustration. Often, that feeling is linked to a failure to connect with any sense of purpose in life. Nowadays, vast numbers of people feel a lack of purpose. Virtually no one is immune. Even the person with a strong spiritual philosophy can nevertheless find himself in this situation. In fact, it's often the person who intellectually understands what these changing times are all about who still ends up feeling a frustrating lack of purpose and direction. In part, this is because intellectual knowledge isn't enough. The changes happening in this millennium shift engage and challenge us at every aspect of our lives, ourselves. Physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. In an effort to document how people of today are experiencing inner earth changes, I invited more than 200 students of the case material to submit written summaries of how the times of change were being experienced personally. Many of the accounts I received put an emphasis on the pace of life. For example, one woman's report said, "How am I currently experiencing the times of change? Very fast. Everything seems or feels very fast. A problem comes up fast, and the solution comes up fast. 2. Communications, relationships, health. I don't know how to put this into words." This person went on to describe that the critical role played by balance is moving from one unexpected spot to another. Properly approached, this movement takes on the quality of a joyful dance. Everything about these changing times for me is like walking, taking steps, always poised and flexible enough to put my next step down in a different place than I expected. The challenge is to stay in balance when a stepping stone is moved after I've already started to take the next step. Or perhaps the challenge is to be ready to jump to a different stone. It's not uncomfortable now as it was at first. It feels more like doing a dance and enjoying it. For other people, the essence of these times of change has been a test of desire and will. Most notably, our failures and disappointments force us to surrender our familiar sense of what's best. Inner earth changes often mean giving up willfulness. As one woman put it, my world in these times of change has been completely shaken up over a period of a few years. It has been just like gigantic thunderstorms in most areas of my life. I have been going through a process of learning how to withdraw, lose, and give up the things I desire, whether I want to or not. Emotionally, it has not been easy. To adapt with sanity, I have to continue to flow through it and learn to trust in a higher power. Another person focused his analysis on the need to be fluid and refrain from unnecessary battles, especially battles against inevitable change. I experienced tremendous changes in the workplace, economy, and society. It has been difficult to adjust initially, but now I am letting go and trying to flow with it. I am admitting that old structures, both in the workplace and in personal life, are not worth supporting in battle. In fact, the change will. As I accept it, help me to grow. It's an adjustment, but I know that to fight is to lose. Simply having knowledge doesn't make us immune from confusion. Possession of book learning doesn't necessarily mean that the ideas have been fully internalized. Yet in spite of knowledge about the Millennium Prophecies, any of us can nevertheless slip into a frustrating lack of purpose. With a part of our minds, we can be very objective and on top of things, but with another side of ourselves, we can directly experience pain and disorientation as the old ways die. Each one of us must go through this death and rebirth process, for to varying degrees, each one of us has bought into the traditional mainstream world that is going through such difficult changes, and therefore that aspect of ourselves invariably must experience the transition. This is, in essence, is what inner millennium shift is all about. When we have overwhelming feelings of fatigue or a despairing lack of any sense of direction, it's all very natural. We are just passing through the test of transformation. We don't need to feel guilty for those days when we're caught up in our personal inner millennium shift. Not only do many of us feel a lack of energy as old patterns are dying, but frequently also a lack of enthusiasm. We may go through periods when the desire is just not there to do what we have long thought was good for us. This may surface as a dry spell in our prayer or meditation life. It may be a period of having no commitment to the nutrition that we know is best for us. Or it may be a general lack of caring and enthusiasm for working on a problem relationship. For other people, a nagging sort of anxiety sets in when the inner millennium shift begins in a society that is changing as fast as ours. What can we depend on? Not interest rates, not prices, not our political leaders, nor our physical environment. Next week there may be an earthquake in our backyards, or we may discover that our community's water supply is polluted with industrial waste. We can fall into worrying. What will come next? We can become numbed by all the changes. We can become frustrated to see the many people, institutions, and conditions that were once so stable now appear so unreliable. In the midst of this, who can really plan for the future? And without a future to work toward, how can one have a sense of purposefulness in life? That's a dismal way of thinking. But lots of people follow that line of reasoning. The sense of pessimism is strong. It's a widely held belief that the lives of our children will not be as good as our own have been, at least in terms of a material standard of living, and that reflects a radical shift in the attitudes and spirit of the American people over the last generation. One way of interpreting such an alteration is to look at it in terms of the inner millennium shift. Those changes are undermining the morale of the nation, and it's probably not just in America. People in great numbers are anxious. pessimistic, and unenthusiastic about their own lives and about the future. But there are certainly options available to us. There are other ways of responding to the inner millennium shift. Admittedly, the challenge sometimes seems daunting. Events and conditions appear to shift so rapidly that it's hard to find any steady points of reference. Confusion, fatigue, and anxiety are natural, sometimes even the norm. Virtually no one is going to be immune from these symptoms. They come from living in a world that is being fundamentally altered. However, feelings of despair and pessimism need not become a way of life or a permanent state of consciousness. Case's prophetic visions contain a purposeful, hopeful impression of the outcome of these changes. The testing really does have a reason. Of course, the word test has negative connotations for most of us. Even if you did well in school, there's bound to be a measure of anxiety or resentment attached to the word. Perhaps we can find a new feeling to associate with it, one that reminds us of strength and accomplishment that can come with meeting a trial and successfully proving oneself. Case suggested that each of us is being tested by the creative forces of the universe. This has always gone on. Human life has always contained challenges through which the depths and beauty of the human spirit can emerge. Something is special, though, about these times in which we live right now. The test is one with higher stakes, not so much for us personally, but for humanity as a whole and for the planet itself. And in this case, the testing is not so much like an exam that we might fail and then be expelled from school. Instead, it's a kind of testing that comes from our own benefit, to push us into being something better. It will force us to make changes in ourselves, changes that are likely to make us more capable of living in a different sort of social world and even physical world. Case's vision of the future describe a very different kind of world than the one we're familiar with. The distinctions aren't simply the positions of coastlines or mountain ranges. We're passing through a period of personal and collective testing because it's preparing us to live in a planetary culture that operates by a new set of rules and assumptions. We can see the first hints of this fact already. We're discovering that we truly are a world community. The ancient concept of national boundaries is becoming very elusive. Examples quickly come to mind. We're inseparably linked economically. We share an atmosphere and set of interconnected oceans. We're linked electronically around the globe with a kind of technological nervous system for the human family. The evidence continues on, leading to one inescapable conclusion. We live in times when the world is being turned upside down. It really is a whole new ballgame, and we'd better be ready to play by a new set of rules, assumptions, and principles. Case's contemporary Carl Jung had a similar notion. The two were born just 2 years apart, though they did their work without direct knowledge of each other. Jung coined the term modern man to refer to just the sort of woman or man who was prepared to move beyond the traditional world. Such an individual was ready to be a citizen of just the sort of world that we are now, thrust into whether we are ready for it or not. Writing in the 1930s, Jung describes in his book Modern Man in Search of a Soul such a courageous step, but it's one that he sees as more or less optional. Chosen by relatively few, as we near the end of the 20th century, it now seems that all of us must be ready for what Jung envisioned decades ago. Only the man who is modern in our meaning of the term really lives in the present. He alone has a present-day consciousness, and he alone finds that the way of life which correspond to earlier levels pall upon him. The values and strivings of those past worlds no longer interest him. Thus he has estranged himself from the mass of men who live entirely within the bounds of tradition. Indeed, he is a completely modern only when he has come to the very edge of the world, leaving behind him all that has been discarded and outgrown, and acknowledging that he stands before a void out of which all things may grow. With the inner millennium shift, where each being challenged to become such modern women and men, Case's vision about the very times in which we are now living emphasizes one basic principle. For each of us there already is, or soon will be, a test that gives us the opportunity to prepare ourselves for the millennium, for the new root race as it was described in chapter 3. You expect a new root race? What are you doing to prepare for it? For many of us, that preparatory challenge is found in some sort of our lives where we are especially being made to feel uncomfortable, to feel pinched. It may be in a particular kind of interpersonal relationship. For some, it may lie in finances. For others, it will be a desire pattern of body or mind that needs to be curtailed. But whatever it is, we have one thing in common. During this test, to prepare us for living in the 21st century, pressure is being put on something we have directly placed between ourselves and God. The test is a challenging opportunity to change our relationship to God by altering something in ourselves, be it a worry, desire, attachment, fear, or anything else. In many cases, the requirement of the preparatory test is merely to move something, not necessarily remove it from our lives. For example, if our test is in terms of a preoccupation about money, then the challenge is to assign money a lower priority in our lives and put God first. Having passed through the test, we might still use money in our daily affairs, but its importance in our lives would have changed. In another case, the test might be in a relationship with a person to whom we are overly attached. Perhaps what is required is a change of priorities, not necessarily removing that person totally from our presence. Again, the test is to discover how to put God first in our lives. If we can do that, then we are much more likely to be psychologically and spiritually comfortable with the values of an emerging new world that Case foresaw. However, the work that is required of us in order to pass through such a test, the alterations we have to make, will indeed feel like upheavals and earth changes inside of us. The dynamic quality of God. In order to cope with and understand the inner millennium shift, we need a clearer notion of how God works in the material realm. So many spiritual teachers and writers of sacred literature have spoken of the timeless, eternal, unchanging quality of God. In these times, when outer conditions change so rapidly, they might counsel us to put our trust in the one thing that never changes, God's perfect spirit and love for us. Undoubtedly, great comfort may be found in experiencing firsthand this characteristic of the divine. However, if our knowledge of God never grows beyond that experience, it implies that the world of change around us has nothing to do with God. Simply understanding God to be the steady point of reference in the midst of whirlwind change actually misses the full picture of our Creator. The nature of God is paradoxical. From the reference point of human consciousness, God is best understood as a two-sided coin or as the two poles of a bar magnet. Certainly, God is a steady, reliable consciousness of love that never wavers. However, God is also the God of unfoldment and of evolution. God is creativity and hence the change that accompanies any creation. Dealing with this paradox is a crucial challenge for our times. As with most polarities or paradoxes, we might be tempted to embrace one side of the truth and exclude the other side. A good example of this is in religious fundamentalism, not just Christian fundamentalism. It's no secret that religious fundamentalism has been on the rise throughout these final decades of the old millennium. Fundamentalists have a strict notion of God's nature. It's basically a static one. Of course, they do admit that God may cause some changes now and then. For example, in the Old Testament, we find stories of how God causes the destruction of cities and people because spiritual laws are not being obeyed. But for the fundamentalists of any religious persuasion, God is to be worshipped mainly because of one reason: the unchanging, timeless reality of divine existence and spiritual laws. It's just as possible to embrace the other side of the coin, but inherent problems exist if we exclusively adopt the opposite end of the scale and claim that God is only the God of creation and evolution. Now things get slippery and vague. What happens if we say that each generation must discover its own spiritual realities? It eliminates any sense of continuity, and we can fall into the mire of relativism. Suddenly we have no point of reference. Everyone is doing his or her own thing. We can easily muddle the distinction between genuinely creative acts and self-indulgent habits. Claiming that everything is always changing leaves us with no awareness of where we are going, simply because there is nothing against which we can measure ourselves. No, the answer lies at neither end of the polarity. Like all other polar tensions, the answer is the middle way, the midpoint of the continuum. Like all paradoxes, we're forced to find a third truth, one that can include both of the other two. This leads us to one of Case's most important millennium prophecies. In the years just ahead, we will come to a new understanding of God and the creative forces that shape the universe. What will this new understanding look like? On the one hand, Case predicts that we will come to see more clearly than ever that God's influence is dynamic and transformative. When we feel tests and pressures to change, it's the work of our Creator that we experience. But at the same time, we'll come to a deep understanding of how God brings influence that are constant, reliable points of reference. It's to be a balancing trick for us. We need to be guided by the unchanging truth of spiritual law and simultaneously accept the divine nudges to evolve and grow into something more than we have been. Higher dimensional life. For those who find abstract analogies or models to be helpful tools for understanding, here's one that may be especially useful. It illustrates what's going on when we're stretched by the force of change in our lives. The essence of this analogy was proposed by a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Lama Anagarika Govinda, in his book Creative Meditation and Multidimensional Consciousness. And even if such abstractions aren't your cup of tea, give this one a try. You may still find that these images stimulate an intuition about how the times of testing are potentially expanding our consciousness. Let's playfully create a picture of what the inner millennium shift may do to human consciousness. Imagine that your self-awareness is two-dimensional. Suppose, for example, that it's just the surface area of a square drawn on a tabletop. You have length and width, but not height, because you are just a surface. Now take the analogy one step further. As you imagine being this square living on a tabletop, suppose you are entering times of change. You are experiencing challenges that test you and try to push you to grow into a higher dimensional being. In fact, that's just what living in a modern times feels like. We're being nudged into a higher dimensional awareness. In Lama Govinda's analogy, we, as two-dimensional squares, are being pushed to become something more, three-dimensional cubes. A. Initial state as a two-dimensional square. B. Forces at work on us in times of change. And C. Possible new state. What we experience as we're pushed through this transitional point between the old and the new? We feel like we're being stretched, and it comes quite naturally for us to be afraid. But afraid of what? Basically, it's the fear of our own destruction. The square worries that in becoming a three-dimensional cube, its original squareness will be destroyed. In other words, we worry that in these times of change, inner and outer, our old identities will be destroyed. Fear is a big topic for our times, so let's look at it more carefully here in the analogy. The fear is reasonable under only one condition: the impact of forces of change in the familiar dimensions we already inhabit. In Govinda's imaginative analogy, the square should be afraid only of the forces that try to alter its length and width. For example, certain forces might try to change it into a triangle, pentagon, or some other two-dimensional figure. But certain other forces of change do not threaten the square's identity. The force of change that challenged the square to be transformed into a cube aren't threatening in the same way. Those forces that want to stretch the square into a three-dimensional cube aren't concerned with altering the squareness. They want to build upon what's already there. In exactly the same way, Case's Millennium Prophecies invite us to see the new world that must be built upon what is already here. That's just as surely true of the new self in each one of us that is trying to be born. It's to be a lifting and transformation of what we already are. So what kinds of forces are we dealing with most often in these times of changes? The first type or the second? The ones that try to undermine who we know ourselves to be, or the ones that try to stretch us by building on what we already are? The inner millennium shift is most often about the second kind. The familiar traditional ways of life exist in the two dimensions of our squareness. Those forces are usually content to keep going on in just the ways they have been. The forces of change come from a higher dimension, trying to transform us into a richer awareness of life. And therefore, more often than not, our fears about self-destruction in these challenging times are based on a misunderstanding of what's going on. The analogy demonstrates beautifully why fear is unfounded. Who we've known ourselves to be isn't on the verge of destruction. Rather, it's something to be built upon. The square is not eliminated as the cube is created. Look carefully at the cube in the illustration and see that the original square is still there. But what has happened to it? Its relative importance has been redefined. Previously it was the whole show, and now it has become only a part of a greater whole. This is what we can expect as the inner millennium shift does its work on us. Our current identity isn't to be destroyed, but instead put into a new perspective. We are being tested to become more than what we are now. The old will be given a new place. Many of our current likes and dislikes, many of our current habit patterns of living must be seen in a new perspective. The relative importance in our lives must be redefined. A model for understanding inner changes. One way to better understand the inner millennium shift is to borrow a concept from Gestalt psychology, a type of perceptual psychology formulated in Germany. Its essence is the question of how we perceive the world. Consciousness itself is largely a perceptual matter. Your awareness is determined mainly by what you see, both in an outward physical way and in your subjective impressions of the inner world. When these pieces of outer and inner experience are put together, they create the gestalt that is functional for you in the moment. Gestalt psychology questions the mechanism within us that makes certain objects or patterns in an overall field of view stand out, whereas other objects or patterns remain as background. The synthesis of these elements, some foreground and some background, creates the overall perception or experience we have. The classic example is the visual paradox which most of us have encountered. What do you see? A white goblet or two darkened faces? Probably you see both, but not at the same time. In any specific moment of perception, certain items stand out as foreground and others recede as background. The gestalt under which we operate in our perceptions is merely a control system that selects certain things to perceive while others are generally ignored. If your gestalt defined white space to be insignificant in the drawing above, then you would see the two faces. However, another gestalt would also have been possible for you, one that would cause you to see the goblet. Gestalts become ways of thinking or states of consciousness. Suppose as a teenager you were frequently lonely and never had dates. Even though you wished you could, with the consciousness you had at that age, what kind of gestalt controlled your perceptions of life around you? For example, walking through a shopping center on a Saturday afternoon. What did you see? What emerged as foreground perceptions most likely were members of the opposite sex about your own age. Most else was not of interest to you, and was little noticed. But suppose you are now 40 years old, married with 3 children, and it is the Saturday afternoon before Christmas. You are in a shopping center trying to get last-minute shopping done. What do you notice? What does your current consciousness, your present gestalt, select as foreground perceptions? Perhaps bargain-priced toys in store windows. Perhaps the clothes that other children you pass are wearing. You are a different person than you were as a teenager. Your consciousness has changed, and therefore so have your patterns of perception. This principle of a gestalt leads us to a related concept, which will give us a key to inner millennium shift. That concept is the paradigm. Simply stated, a paradigm is a set of assumptions that creates a mindset for perceiving the outer world, or even for seeing oneself. It's much like a gestalt. Although the term paradigm is used more frequently in many disciplines, usually a paradigm refers to an agreed-upon set of assumptions which a group of scholars or even a whole society has adopted. However, this agreement is often passed on in an automatic or unconscious way. Within a given academic discipline, new students learn the old paradigm from their teachers and then years later teach it to additional new students. For example, there is a paradigm within the domain of Egyptology. Those assumptions include a time frame that does not permit much in the way of civilization to have occurred in Egypt before 3000 BC. With that mindset, each new archaeological discovery is viewed and categorized within the agreed-upon assumptions. The paradigm of modern Egyptology is made up of a handful of key assumptions. Rarely are those assumptions questioned. Anyone trained in this field professionally joins the club. By ascribing to the mindset of his or her colleagues, some latitude may be permitted within the group that shares a paradigm. There is occasionally room for creativity, but that creativity is to be directed toward the discovery of further assumptions which can be added on to the existing paradigm. However, within some groups, such as religious orders with their assumptions about God and the proper way to live, there may be no room at all for truly creative thinkers. The assumptions have been set, there is no room for more. The only creative work to be done within such groups is to discover new ways to match up the assumptions, to find new correlations. In other words, groups or fields of study with the rigid paradigms are interested only in finding new ways to prove what they have already assumed is true. Admittedly, a study of paradigms can become rather confusing. There are so many different varieties of paradigms. How does one know which are relevant to one's personal journey toward understanding? The problem is complex because our modern world is comprised of so many different fields of study. It was far easier in earlier times. There might have been only the religious and the political paradigms of the day, with only two, which rarely got in each other's way. Life was more straightforward. The local priest would tell you about the religious assumptions concerning God and the afterlife. The king or his local representative would tell you about the political assumptions, who were the good guys and who were the bad guys, and whose orders to follow. Areas of study such as agriculture and science had to fall in line with religious and political paradigms of the day. People like Galileo rudely discovered this fact when they tried to assert new assumptions for science which contradicted the established norms. But in our times around the turn of the millennium, things are a bit more hazy. It's hard to identify very clearly the prevailing mindset for areas like religion and politics, and the set of assumptions for certain scientific disciplines, such as physics, has been changing quite rapidly. Nevertheless, there seems to be a common ground to the mindsets of the various groups, disciplines, and a few basic assumptions that the majority of people in Western culture hold in common. We can call this the Old World paradigm to contrast it to a New World paradigm, which characterizes Case's vision of the 21st century and beyond. Before attempting to identify the specific items of the Old World paradigm, we should make it clear that not every person in the Western culture ascribes to these assumptions. Some people already live fully under the New World paradigm. Others of us shift back and forth. We have days or moments in which consciousness moves and we suddenly see life and ourselves through the eyeglasses of the new assumptions. But then we find ourselves slipping back into the familiar, old world view. But when does this old world view of life look like? What are its assumptions? The list might well include assumptions like those below. They are certainly not what Case's Millennium Prophecies predict for the 21st century mindset, but these ways of seeing life still hold powerful sway today. 1. Humans aren't really part of nature. Even though we may have descended from ape-like ancestors, we are now apart from the natural world. It's not necessary to try to be one with the planet Earth because it's basically dead. We do things to the earth and nature, not in cooperation with them. 2. Supply is limited. There is only so much energy and so much food. The universe is running down. Entropy controls not just the cosmos, but our own little microcosms as well. There is simply not enough for everybody. 3. People are generally selfish or evil. The essence of the human spirit is to get what you want. People cooperate only when it is likely to lead to some reward. 4. Bigger is better. Quantity determines value. The more people who buy a book or see a movie, the better it is. The more money a person or a company makes, the more successful they are. 5. Things are real only if they can be physically measured. Concepts such as thought, energy, ESP, and healing vibrations are all merely delusions. 6. There is only one truth, and once we think we have it, it is our obligation to make sure others adopt it and the world is run by it. These 6 assumptions aren't the only ones that might be on the list, but they're an effective sampling of the worldview that is familiar to us. They create a mindset for perceiving the outer world and ourselves. The assumptions create an interlocking matrix, which is very resistant to being tampered with. However, it's just this paradigm that is under siege in today's world. Where is the paradigm? It isn't locked in a bank vault somewhere to keep it safe. It's within human minds, within human consciousness, and the old world paradigm is being challenged by an emergent new set of assumptions, directly contradicting not just one or two of these 6, but all of them. Because the old world paradigm is within us, we feel the strains of it being challenged. Our own minds are the battleground, and this is one meaning of the inner millennium shift. The foundations of the old world view of life are being shaken, and we feel it. Alternatives for handling paradigm shifts. History shows us that occasionally the assumptions by which humans view life can shift dramatically. The change from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance is a good example. During this transition period, which spanned more than 100 years, some of the cornerstones of medieval thought were shaken. A world that was universally understood to be flat was discovered to be spherical. The Earth, believed to be at the center of the solar system, was found to be only one of many planets traveling around the sun. The Protestant Reformation transformed Christianity. There was a clear paradigm shift in Western culture. Since the beginning of the Renaissance, there have certainly been major changes in our world and in human assumptions about reality. Breakthroughs in science and in the technology of warfare, in particular, have altered our lifestyles and thoughts about the world in which we live. However, the transition in human awareness, which Case and the others foresee in the coming generation, is the most dramatic paradigm shift since the 15th century. Once again, there is a possibility that nearly all the assumptions held by the vast majority of society will be challenged and replaced. It's not easy to live through a paradigm shift. An ancient Chinese curse is noteworthy. It is translated by some, "May you live in times of change," and by others as, "May you live in interesting times." Either way, it resonates in our own era. It's difficult to live under such conditions because there are so many ways that people respond to changing assumptions and perceptions. Everyone seems to react differently to the uncertainty, and it's hard to know where people stand. Common understanding and belief make life simpler, and their lack can be frustrating. For example, someone living in 1500 might not have known if a new acquaintance was a flat earth man or a round earth man. Or someone living in the 1550s might have worried about whether his neighbor was joining the new Reformation movement or remaining loyal to the traditional church. In our times, we wonder how the person sitting next to us on the airplanes will react if we talk about meditation or ecology. Or we hope that our relatives will understand if we quit a lucrative but demoralizing job in order to take work that creates personal joy. The sense of community among people is easily threatened in times of paradigm shift, and added to this is the personal stress we feel, the inner millennium shift as the old ways in us begin to die. This extraordinary mix of factors is what Case foresaw decades ago, as he envisioned the turn of the millennium. It all produces an exciting, troublesome, anxious age. And so, how are we to respond to times like these? There are two alternatives. We can try to hold on to the old paradigm, or we can embrace a new set of assumptions which is being born. Let's look first at some of the elaborate schemes that people sometimes use in trying to hold on to the old ways. Holding on to the old paradigm. This option is the equivalent of, let's go down with the ship. Some people are so determined to stay with what's familiar that they even contribute indirectly to their own demise. Of course, it probably doesn't look that way to them, for those who persist. With the old mindset, the adversity is merely a challenging test of their loyalty to the truth. And so the people of our times who want to retain the 6 assumptions previously listed have a case to argue. They are defenders of a worldview that has, in many ways, served us well. These half-dozen assumptions, that familiar paradigm, has been a worldview that has produced many fruits. Look at the progress of humanity in the past 2 centuries, they point out. They argue that there's no reason to believe that the same worldview cannot continue to produce results. In fact, one definition of political conservatism is applying the worldview and methods that have solved problems in the past to the new problems that face us today. However, the difficulty with a conservative approach comes if there's an unwillingness to look at facts. The old world mindset operates with a gestalt that makes anomalies, events or conditions that contradict one of the assumptions seems like background at best. They don't see what others see. For those of us who have experienced contradictions of one or more of the old assumptions, it's very frustrating. Old paradigm thinkers refuse to see or admit what we know to be true. However, it may not be lying or conspiracy or deceit on the part of the people trying to hold on to the old assumptions. Perhaps they really cannot recognize something because for them it's only a part of the background. For them it's as if those anomalies don't exist. Let's look at 2 modern examples. There are many instances in which a group of people seems to refuse to look at the evidence. Consider psychic ability. Although a majority of people may say that they believe there's something to ESP, this isn't the case among key decision makers, scholars, scientists, and others in positions of intellectual authority. For this influential group, it's as if the strong scientific evidence for ESP doesn't exist. Generally, they either refuse to admit that the reports of parapsychologists are true, or they refuse to make the effort to look into these matters. Naturally, it's frustrating for backers of parapsychology. More than 30 years of carefully controlled scientific research has been meticulously documented in the Journal of Parapsychology and the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research. These researchers and their advocates believe that an understanding of ESP might help change people's attitude about the human family. What's more, psychic sensitivity is a skill that Case foresaw as widespread in the 21st century. However, we might wonder why so many intelligent individuals in our society so resistantly hang on to the old world assumption that there's nothing to telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, or psychokinesis, mind over matter. But consider how threatening such a shift in belief would be to some of the leading thinkers of our world. For example, most all of the previous findings of psychological research would become suspect because telepathy, conscious or unconscious, might be possibly have influenced the experimental subjects to do or say what the experimenter hoped. Decades of very expensive research would suddenly lose much or all of its reliability. Just think, too, what would happen to research methods in physics or chemistry if one had to account for the possible effects of psychokinesis? Here is a phenomenon that, if true, is so elusive that it cannot be easily shielded or measured. For many people, too much is at stake to readily shift assumptions and take an open-minded look at the findings of parapsychology. Ecology provides us with a second good example of how some people are trying to resist a new way of looking at life, especially that new way seems to threaten their own professional or personal investments. In the last 3 decades, there's been considerable progress with the environment, and to a growing number of people, there is a clear evidence that we have polluted the oceans and air, perhaps to a point beyond repair. Furthermore, it seems increasingly clear that humans are very much a part of an ecological whole. When we do something to affect nature, then we've got to expect to get something of equal quality back in return. And yet that sort of assumption runs contrary to the mindset that has created a heavily industrial world. It threatens a lifestyle based largely on plastic and mass-produced interchangeable goods. The leaders of such industries and the people who have become dependent upon them are inclined to see the anomaly. Their gestalt places in perceptual background the disturbing new evidence of what we are doing to our planet. They tenaciously hold on to the old paradigm, refusing to consider the evidence that might require a shift is the most simplistic response, but this is the only one method by which people try to hold on to the old set of assumptions. When the world is changing, a more subtle technique is trying to patch up the old system. It looks like an open-minded willingness to change, but in essence is not that at all. The steps for this approach go as follows. First, identify the assumption that seems to be disproved by an anomaly. Refuse to consider that this one shaky assumption is a sign that all the major assumptions should be seriously questioned. Instead, maintain one's strong emotional ties to the familiar package of beliefs. Next, try to arrive at a rewritten assumption for the one under attack. Perhaps an added footnote will account for this disturbing new evidence. Or at worst, the problematic assumption will have to be rewritten, but in a form, no matter how awkward, that will let one hang on to all the rest of the old paradigm. For example, what do we do when statistics show the rising incidence of cancer in our society? Do we question the entire package of assumptions? The stress created by big is better thinking? The sense of animosity created by a competitive economic system? The horrendous things we do to nature to extract the resources we demand? Here is a blatant anomaly that announces that something is not right with our style of living on planet Earth, but rather than look for a new set of assumptions, a strong tendency exists to hang on to the old worldview and merely make some patchwork. So what happens? Medical science selects a few scapegoats. It finds several dozen substances that are carcinogenic. Then it announces that you can still be safe and healthy within the old paradigm if you just pay attention to the new footnote, which warns, don't let yourself come in contact with any of these known cancer-causing substances. By way of analogy, it's like a man with a leaking roof on his old house. He springs a leak in March and patches it up, but another one occurs in April and 2 in May. He keeps up this patchwork process, never considering that the time has come for a new roof. He can conceivably keep this up, but the day will come when his entire roof will be an awkward-looking array that is totally patchwork. The sum of his time and dollar expense in all that patchwork will be greater than if he had gotten a new roof. Sometimes the patchwork looks ludicrous, like the emperor with no clothes. The situation almost begs for someone to demand courageously, how could that be? But the stakes are high. If people are determined to hang on to the old mindset, then the old assumptions with their new footnotes will do just fine. no matter how awkward it looks. In fact, such people would even proudly point to such alterations as proof of their open-mindedness and willingness to change with the times. Let's look at the example of this technique for handling changing times. The old theory that the sun and the planets travel around the earth was a major assumption in the medieval paradigm. However, there were anomalies that should have alerted people to the fact that their view of reality was inadequate. For example, anyone who watched the planet Mars night after night would observe a strange phenomenon. It would seem to move gradually across the background of the fixed stars. Over the course of weeks and months, it would seem to be traveling through the various constellations of the sky. This progression was very much expected because people were sure that Mars was circling the Earth. But occasionally, Mars would do a curious thing. It would reverse its course, and for several weeks seem to move backward. A modern-day astrologer would call this a planet going retrograde. The observation, which could readily be made by anyone, seemed to cast doubt upon the assumption that the planets, the sun, and the moon were all revolving around the earth. For many centuries after this retrograde motion was noticed, people were not willing to part with the assumptions of their paradigm. It was difficult to ignore the evidence of an anomaly, therefore the next best technique was employed. They patched up the old assumptions, and the theory was changed. According to the revised notion, the earth was still the center of the solar system, but some of the planets did not traverse a circular or even elliptical orbit around the Earth. Rather, planets like Mars traveled with a periodic loop-de-loop in their paths. In the next illustration, we first the pathway Mars would appear to take as one watched it over the weeks move against the background of the fixed stars. The second illustration shows the patched-up assumption, the belief adopted by those who weren't willing to create a new paradigm. The idea of such an orbital pathway seems ludicrous to us with our modern knowledge of astronomy, but what else could the people of that day do? Their worldview and mindset were too precious for them to seriously consider new assumptions. It was not until the Renaissance that a sensible idea of the solar system was generally accepted and the retrograde motion of the planets was easily explained. The relative difference in speed between the Earth's movement around the Sun and that of another planet like Mars would create the occasional appearance of backward movement. We can laugh at the people 600 years ago in their naivete and stubbornness, but isn't it possible that 600 years from now our descendants will view some of our patched up assumptions as equally amusing? To what degree do we now try to modify old assumptions to avoid having to develop an entirely different worldview? Or in what ways do we take something that is of the new world and distort it so that it looks like part of the old world? When the world is changing in the way ours is now, such methods can only temporarily slow the movement. People who would hang on to the old assumptions may still be in the majority of the evolution of consciousness on this planet. It doesn't depend on majority vote. If it did, then things would never really move forward. Human fears and desires would keep us stuck. Paradigm shifts on the scale of the Renaissance happen in spite of the majority. Those who insist on trying various methods to maintain the old set of assumptions will find the coming decades to be especially troublesome. They are likely to feel the inner millennium shift most acutely. The temporizing, patching up, denying techniques won't work for long. They, like all of us, will have to face the new world being born around them, and more importantly, being born within themselves. Joining the emergent paradigm, in response to inner and outer millennium shifts, we can choose to work cooperatively with a new set of values and assumptions. Case predicted that some individuals would be pioneers of a new planetary consciousness. Who are those people, and how can we recognize them in today's world? They are the ones who sense that the old ways are dying and can sense a fresh orientation for humanity and planet Earth. They are people who are generally patient and not driven by fears. They trust that there is a plan to what is going on in the world, that there is a spirit of the times that is in keeping with God's plan. They know themselves to be co-creators with God in the transformation to a new worldview, but they humbly recognize that their work is to respond to the divine initiative which will be revealed to them. What are the characteristics of such a person? In fact, such an individual is within each of us. All of us have the potential to be among those who make this kind of response to the inner millennium shift. All of us have the capability of being receptive in these times, which is the first characteristic of this sort of person. This isn't passivity, because the builders of 21st century culture need to be active and involved. Rather, it's a matter of listening before acting. By way of an analogy, it's like being a swimmer in open waters and taking the time to become aware of the position and direction of a current. Once that perception is made, one can then actively swim in the current and be carried along by it. It's a matter of being able to sense the true spirit of these times. Such listening must reach beneath the surface of current events in the outer world. The true spirit of these times isn't the fear of being downsized, social unrest, or even earth changes. There will be many symptoms of what is going on, but we need to look deeper to see the real spirits of what is being born. In fact, the nightly television news is more likely to document the dying of the old world than the birth of the new. A real listener, a real co-creator of the world, Case predicted, for the 21st century, senses the elements emerging for a new paradigm. He or she then acts in response to what has been noticed. That person is able to give expression and form to the new assumptions about life. This sort of person, who is within us all as a potential, is also able to put aside fears, or she is able to courageously accept that moment of void we encounter when we have to let go of the old, and yet the new isn't yet fully within our grasp. We might wonder, what is that most scares people about times of change and paradigm shifts? Do we fear that the future might be worse than the past has been? Or rather, are we more afraid of the void, of that moment of uncertainty and vulnerability, when the old assumptions have faded but we are not yet clear about the new? We need the confidence of a trapeze artist who has let go of one swing and momentarily hangs helplessly out in space before grabbing on to the next. He knows his own momentum will carry him forward to meet the swing he trusts will be there. In many arenas of life, people confront the difficulties posed by that void. For example, in their vocations and in their choice about close personal relationships, many individuals stick with an old job, even though they cannot imagine having any other job that will be more distasteful to them, but they are afraid to quit. It's oftentimes not so much worried that they would remain unemployed as because they cannot stand the thought of being in that uncertain, vulnerable void for any amount of time. It takes courage to move on to a new vocation, a new set of friends, or a whole new set of assumptions for living. The capacity to overcome the fears within each of us. Another characteristic of the person who embraces the new paradigm is an alchemical type of skill. The alchemists of ancient times attempted to turn lead into gold. More accurately, they tried to transform the base or earthly aspects of human consciousness into enlightenment. A version of this skill belongs to the pioneers of the Millennium. Some things viewed as weaknesses by the old set of assumptions can be seen as strengths by the new paradigm. Case was especially skillful at showing individuals how this transformative principle could work at a personal level. He often described how a fault could be lifted into a strength. For example, one man who came to Case on many occasions was known to be extremely talkative, often to the annoyance of those around him. However, Case pointed out how this fault could be alchemically transmuted into a great strength as he became an eloquent and eager spokesperson for spiritual truth. Certainly not everything held in low esteem by the old paradigm will suddenly be much admired in the new one. It's the skill of the co-creators of a new world to recognize and work with those qualities that are good candidates for the alchemical change. Let us consider two examples. One candidate is sensitivity. In the old world, it's often considered a weakness to be sensitive. In the competitive worlds of our vocations, the sensitivity person is likely to get ulcers. Sensitivity generally runs counter to the assumption that there are limited resources, and one had better be tough to struggle hard for his own share. But in a new paradigm, sensitivity can be transformed from weakness to strength. For example, a requirement for leadership in the 21st century may be sensitivity to others. Another candidate is interdependence. This is a good illustration of the process at work on a global scale. In the old paradigm, it's weakness for one nation to be dependent on another nation. For example, we say that the United States has a weakness in requiring the oil of the Persian Gulf countries. We say that Belgium is a weak nation because it's dependent upon France, Germany, and the United States for military protection. And by old world assumptions, these instances and many more are true. However, with a new paradigm, the assumptions have changed. Now we can see that we are one people on planet Earth. What benefits the people of one nation can potentially benefit those throughout the world. Our interdependence becomes a strength, alchemically transformed into a stimulus for cooperation, a characteristic once held in low esteem, and become something that is newly admired and appreciated. Case described this principle to one man, intent on being a leader in the creation of the new world. He has been given of old that stone that was rejected of the builders has become the cornerstone. Such is the work of the builders of a new world, to recognize and nurture the qualities of life that can go through such a dramatic switch. Finally, pioneers of the 21st century culture that Case envisioned will treat with respect the elements of the old paradigm. They won't be angry or full of hatred, simply allowing the old worldview to run its course and die. Instead, it's with love that they take the elements of the old ways and find new places for them. It's a crucial point to understand. Remember that when we move to a new gestalt, for example, seeing the two faces instead of the goblet, the literal elements of the scene did not change. Instead, it was our way of ordering them that was altered. We created new priorities, putting the background into the foreground, or when we stretched a square into the higher dimensional life of being a cube, we did not destroy the square. We merely changed the relative importance and priority of its position. The same must hold true if we are to move properly from a world run by the old paradigm to a world run by the new. Many of the elements of living will remain. The challenge is to arrange, order, and relate them to each other based on a new set of rules. Case's prophecies about the coming centuries make clear that we will still have families, businesses, governments, schools, and agriculture. The shift in paradigms doesn't mean eliminating business just because it may have been poorly operated under the old set of assumptions, nor does it mean throwing out the idea of governments just because wars and hatreds were created when governments operated under the old rules of the game. Intermillennium shift is essentially a changing gestalt, a new way of arranging priorities and relationships. This is far more challenging than just watching the old world die. The current transformation isn't so much one in which the individual elements of the scene change. It's rather the emergence of a new gestalt that sees those elements in an entirely new relationship. And with this new set of priorities, a different and more productive way of living can also be born. That's what the millennium, inner and outer, is really all about.